I'm Callista.
And I'm Teresa, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime. And I think this week we were going to chat about the second season of The Night Manager.
Yeah, I think so. What is it, 9, 10 years since the first season came out?
Yeah, and I actually looked that up because I'm like, what the heck with the delay? And there was some interview with Tom Hiddleston from 2024 saying they had, it sounded like BS to me, that they had to wait all this time to get the script just right. And I'm like, but apparently it's based on a John le Carre, I think that's his pen name, the last name, book. And he also wrote Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy.
Yeah.
Um, and he passed away in 2020. So I guess the first series season kind of was closely related to the first book. And since he had passed on, they didn't have anything. So, I guess they wanted to make sure, that it made sense or it was right. But that's a really, really long, a long time between two things.
Yeah, it's almost like a reboot as opposed to a second season with that length of time.
Exactly. And apparently they have greenlit season 3. And apparently, though there were no specifics, so you got to take that with maybe a big grain of salt, that there won't be quite the delay. So I don't know if that means a year or two or not.
But yeah, I liked the first season, and I think we're not done with it. I think we're like halfway through the second season, and yeah, we're still liking it. Like Tom Hiddleston, obviously not a spoiler, but less Hugh Laurie, like him. I remember we watched all of House.
I know that was a long time ago. He's really good. I like Hugh Laurie.
Who doesn't?
It's true. Yeah, and I always like the spy genre. I just, I don't know. It's I guess I like that, they're generally in far-flung places, somebody's pretending to be something they aren't. Generally there's, seems drugs and wealth and I don't know. And I think Tom Hiddleston does a good job.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I commented though, I think last episode that so I know I'm forgetting her last name, but Camilla, she was in Daisy Jones and the Six.
Yeah, and I think it's like Marone or something like that. It's like I think it's like Marrone, something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
I think you're right.
yeah, she's doing good, and I honestly yeah, I say I like the spy stuff, and I like all the wealthy, all the far-flung locations. I really, I get a kick out of that, but then there's a fine line where I feel like it's too stylized, but, I don't really get that vibe. I mean, yeah, I think it's done well. I honestly though, of course, Hugh Laurie, big fan of his. I kinda like this season better, but
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd say I like it better. I mean, I definitely don't think it's less engaging though, and I think, what I was gonna say about, Camilla, Morrone, if that's her last name, was that I'm not really sure, I know that's a big thing in, like, the Bond films and pretty much any spy film that there needs to be a love interest that I like her, but do we need a love interest every season?
I agree with you. I agree with you. It's like, you know, a totally different genre, but it's like, oh, I don't know, kids grow up together, boy and girl. Oh, okay, it's a romantic comedy. They're going to end up together. Why can't they just be friends? Why can't they be friends like they were when they were 3? Is that really necessary? Same kind of vibe. You
Yeah,
know? Yeah.
I hear that.
Kind of like in you read a romance novel and do they need to end up married and wait, pregnant?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, in a romance novel, you expect them to get together, but they don't need to have the same ending. Not every single couple does.
Every single one. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's true.
All right, was that it?
I think so. We'd recommend, though.
Definitely recommend. Okay, then. So, we're back with another serial killer who targeted gay men in the 90s with the last call killer, who was later unmasked as Richard Rogers. On May 27th, 2001, officers from the New York City Police Department went to Mount Sinai Hospital to catch 50-year-old Richard Rogers while he was on shift in the pediatric intensive care unit. After he was told that he had been the victim of credit card fraud, Richard agreed to accompany them to the police station. By the time the interview began, it was just after midnight on May 28th, and Lieutenant Thomas Hayes from the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office and Detective David Dalrymple from the New Jersey State Police were telling Richard the real reason he had been brought in. They were investigating the murders of four middle aged gay and bisexual men who were last seen alive in Manhattan gay bars before their remains were discovered in garbage bags near roads and highways between 1991 and 1993. When they produced a flyer with the photographs of the last three victims, Thomas Mulcahy, Anthony Marrero, and Michael Sequeira, Richard immediately tried to help by admitting that he knew Michael because they had both gone to the Five Oaks piano bar.
In response to being asked about his travels, Richard said he had taken road trips all over the country, from Florida to California to Atlantic City, even to Arkansas, unaware of the fact that investigators were establishing the fact that he owned a car in which he could carry around the necessary supplies for murder, dismemberment, and disposal. Richard was incredibly cooperative. But when Lieutenant Hayes came right out with it and said that they had hard evidence that connected him to all four murders, Richard's entire demeanor changed. Instead of continuing to sit with his hands in his lap and his feet on the floor, Richard closed himself off by crossing his arms and legs and sitting back in his chair. Richard was done being forthcoming, but by this point, authorities already had enough evidence to put him behind bars. And it was about damn time. Richard Rogers wasn't just a suspected serial killer, he had literally gotten away with murder once before. Why would he have stopped when he had been allowed to walk out of the courtroom as a free man decades earlier?
Despite his luck later in life, Richard Westall Rogers Jr. didn't start off as anything special. Richard was born in Plymouth, Massachusetts on June 16, 1950, as the oldest of five children. His mother was a telephone worker and his father worked as a lobsterman before the family moved to Florida in the early 1960s for him to take a better paid position manufacturing sheet metal. Even before their move to the Sunshine State, Richard had never had many friends. But his 4.0 GPA ensured that he was always a favorite of the bullies at Palmetto High School. Relentlessly taunted by his peers, Richard decided to channel his own cruelty by stabbing a female neighbor. The reason for this attack isn't known, but it led to Richard being sent to a psychiatric ward. However, Richard was allowed to finish high school.
Because that was obviously the smart choice.
Obviously, stabbing someone as a child is clearly a minor mistake that should soon be forgotten. He enrolled at Florida Southern College in 1968 and kept his head down while earning his bachelor's degree in French. But his violent nature wouldn't remain dormant for long. It was while he was pursuing his master's in French at the University of Maine that 23-year-old Richard would take the life of fellow student Frederick Spencer.
Frederick Spencer was born on May 13, 1950, in Boston, Massachusetts, to Louise Weibel Spencer and Claude Spencer. Claude and Louise had initially been drawn to each other while they were studying chemistry at the University of Michigan. As World War II raged on, the pair received their degrees in 1942 and married in September 1944. Having moved to Boston for Claude to continue his studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the couple welcomed first Frederick, then Karen, and a younger son, who was also named Richard, to their family. After Claude graduated with his PhD in chemistry, he got a job with the Norwich Pharmaceutical Company, later renamed Norwich Pharma Services. When Frederick was 9, the family relocated to Norwich, New York, where Louise chased her own career goals by obtaining her master's in education and learning disabilities. Their passions weren't just related to their work. Claude and Louise passed down their love for the outdoors to their children. Frederick spent his younger years exploring the natural world as a Boy Scout. In the summer, the family of five traveled to Vacationland, Maine, where Frederick hiked the rugged mountain terrain, pushing his limits by traversing sections of the Appalachian Trail.
Frederick also wasn't one to slack off academically. On October 24, 1967, he was named by New York's Press and Sun Bulletin as one of 9 Norwich senior high school students to have been given a letter of commendation for their score on the 1967 National Merit Scholarship qualifying test. also known as the preliminary SAT. The following year, the Press and Sun Bulletin mentioned Frederick again on February 14th, 1968, in saying he had earned the Regent Scholarship, which entitled him to $250 to $1,000 per year while studying at any Board of Regents approved college in the state. Frederick's academic achievements continued throughout his college career. Even before he graduated with a science degree from the University of Michigan in 1972, 30 years after his parents had done the same, he was recruited in his senior year by Professor David E. Leonard to pursue his passion for studying insects, and better him than me.
I mean, to each their own, I guess.
Too true. As a graduate student at the Department of Entomology at the University of Maine.
It might not have been vacation land, but Orono, Maine still catered to Frederick's outdoor interest with its many nearby rivers and forests. Preparing to start his graduate program in the fall of 1972, Frederick moved into 10 Main Street. This duplex was only a mile from the University of Maine's flagship campus and was often rented out to students throughout the academic year. As a student in need of affordable accommodation, Frederick shared rent with his two housemates, William Mazeral and Richard Rogers. In the many months that the three lived together, Frederick and Richard bickered frequently. That said, these disagreements were never violent, and the pair managed to begrudgingly coexist. At least they did until the end of April 1973. On April 30th, 1973, two cyclists were pedaling through nearby Old Town, which is not a part of Orono, but a separate city, when they spotted a nylon tent on the outskirts of a pine tree forest, around 20 feet from the remote road they were on. After a closer inspection revealed that the tent was covering a man's body, the bicyclists contacted the authorities. It was quickly determined that the man had been dead for less than 48 hours. Although he had nearly died from the blunt force trauma he had sustained to the back of his head, as evidenced by the 8 lacerations to his skull, his actual cause of death was asphyxiation via a plastic bag.
With a key in his pocket as their only clue to who this man had been, investigators traced it to an Orono post office box that they learned belonged to the roommates on 10 Main Street. Fortunately for Frederick's family, they were not called to identify his body. That traumatic task was laid at the feet of his academic advisor, David E. Leonard, who struggled both to hold his stomach contents and to make the identification due to Frederick's severe facial injuries. Police only had to travel 10 miles from where Frederick's body had been dumped to get to his shared duplex. Upon opening the front door to find the police, William Mazeral couldn't say where either of his housemates currently were. He hadn't laid eyes on Frederick in the last few days, but that wasn't abnormal considering their busy schedules. William let the investigators in, and nothing suspicious immediately jumped out at them. Then they opened Richard's bedroom door. There may not have been signs of a struggle in the rest of the house, but this room was an entirely different, altogether more savage story. Blood splatters decorated the walls, and crimson fingerprints and footprints were scattered across the door and the floor. An unhidden, blood covered hammer was soon determined to have been the cause of the blunt force trauma to Frederick's head.
In light of the overwhelming amount of evidence in Richard's room, he had barely opened the door to the duplex before the police were marching him right back out of it. At the station, detectives grilled him about his movements on Saturday, April 28th, and Richard soon confessed to 22-year-old Frederick Spencer's murder, although that wasn't how Richard described what he had done. Richard said that when he got back on Saturday and opened the door to his bedroom, Frederick was beside his dresser going through his things. Upon seeing Richard, Frederick came at him with a hammer, because that makes total sense.
I mean, it's a completely logical sequence of events.
Once he had managed to get the hammer out of Frederick's grasp, did he throw it across the room? No. Richard hit him in the back of the head with it, claiming that it was purely out of a desire to protect himself. Richard struck him 8 times in all before holding a plastic bag over his face until he suffocated. I mean, he must have been really scared for his life. That is quite the escalation.
To even get the plastic bag over his head, he would have already had to have overpowered Frederick.
Don't be using logic.
That's right.
Even though Richard explained that he didn't call the police because he was panicking, he was apparently clear headed enough to bide his time until darkness fell. With the night as his cover, Richard rolled Frederick's body in a nylon tent, lugged it to his car, and perhaps taking inspiration from the hunting trips he had taken with his father as a child, disposed of it in a nearby forest.
Richard's arrest on May 1st should have meant that he was a one and done murderer. But luck, in the form of an unbelievable verdict, was on this future serial killer's side. Although rumors swirled that Frederick hit on Richard, who was in fact gay, reports vary on whether the gay panic defense was actually used to get Richard off the second-degree murder charge. And for anyone who's saying, what the fuck is that? This bigoted defense tactic generally comes in three versions. The first, defense of insanity or diminished capacity, is that the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity sends the defendant into a panic. Gay panic disorder wasn't even removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until the year of Frederick's murder.
Where it should have never been.
Breach. The second, defense of provocation, involves the defendant being incited to murder by the victim's nonviolent come on. And the third, defense of self defense, stresses the defendant's belief that they were going to be violently attacked because of the victim's sexual orientation or gender identity.
I mean, it's all so ludicrous.
It's just disgusting.
With the tactic's popularity at the time, it's not out of the realm of possibility that the idea that Richard could have reasonably panicked and defended himself, killing Frederick in the process for the outrageous offense of coming on to him, was floating around in the community's, if not the jurors' minds. Whether homophobia played a prominent role or not, Richard's official story of self defense in the face of Frederick's hammer attack wasn't just compelling enough for the judge to agree to reduce the charge to manslaughter, it was enough to persuade the jury, who had deliberated for less than 3 hours, to find him not guilty on November 2nd, 1973. And I can't even comprehend the mental gymnastics necessary to entertain that way of thinking.
His defense must have thanked their lucky stars for that jury.
Yeah. And the extremely homophobic time frame they were living in.
Well, yeah, that helped too.
Yeah. However, before he was admitted to the jail cell in which he spent the 6 months leading up to his 5 day, it's hard not to say sham of a trial, the Orono police carefully jotted down his height and weight and took his fingerprints for the Penobscot County criminal records, an action that would later come back to bite Richard. In the clear for the foreseeable future, Richard took full advantage of his freedom by moving to New York. Instead of continuing to study French, he enrolled at the Pace University School of Nursing. Only months after he earned his master's in medical science in 1978, he became licensed as a registered nurse by the New York State Department of Education in 1979 and began his spotless 22-year nursing career at Mount Sinai Hospital in the Upper East Side of Manhattan.
After Richard was promoted to the position of pediatric surgical nurse, which gave him access to Mount Sinai's operating rooms, he retained the position even after being arrested and acquitted in 1988, this time for assault. On July 11th, 1988, Richard allegedly went home with 47-year-old Sandy Harrow, whom he ran into at a bar in Manhattan. Once they were in Richard's Staten Island apartment, Richard offered him a glass of orange juice. The next thing Sandy knew, he was naked, tied to a bed, and Richard was using him as a punching bag. After being injected with another dose of something, the next time Sandy woke up, he was outside. Although Richard was arrested for the assault in August 1988, he was acquitted in a bench trial after his lawyer, Christopher Nally, claimed that his accuser was making the whole thing up. Or, as he so charmingly put it, The problem here is, Judge, that I believe Mr. Harrow is nuts. In a further act of disregard for Sandy's story, the case was sealed in the wake of the Stapleton Criminal Court judge's ruling.
Another example of why victims don't come forward.
It really does seem like the justice system is often designed to fuck them over.
It sure does. Sadly, shrugged off attacks like the one Sandy experienced remained all too commonplace for members of the LGBTQ plus community in New York City in the early 1990s. Given the rise in violence against gay men as the AIDS epidemic tore through the city, the New York City Gay and Lesbian Anti Violence Project, now the NYC AVP, was founded in the 1980s to support survivors of homophobic attacks, and the organization saw time and time again that these violent episodes were routinely ignored by both the press and the police. As clear evidence of the antipathy many in the force felt towards the community, the NYPD Emerald Society, an Irish American fraternal organization that counted Commissioner Raymond Kelly as a member, passed a resolution opposing the inclusion of LGBTQ plus groups in the 1991 New York City St. Patrick's Day parade. So, when the dismembered remains of gay and bisexual men soon began turning up in trash bags, members of the AVP were the ones to hang up flyers and offer a reward for evidence that could put the killer behind bars. As Gay USA, a cable news program launched in the early 80s by video producer and gay activist Lou Milletta, put pressure on public officials to ramp up the lackluster investigation.
That investigation would eventually center around New York City gay bars. These bars were one of the few places gay men could be themselves and meet up in the early 1990s. But these former havens were about to turn into a serial killer's hunting ground. Having gotten off scot free once again, Richard celebrated by spending time at one of his favorite bars, the Townhouse on East 58th Street in Midtown Manhattan. When Richard wasn't busy singing Broadway show tunes at the piano or chatting about the theater and his work at Mount Sinai, he was clocking the older LGBTQ plus men who were also drawn to this welcoming piano bar. Some patrons were local like Richard, but tourists and traveling businessmen also made a habit of stopping by. 54-year-old Peter Stickney Anderson was one such businessman. Born on March 14th, 1937, Peter grew up in Wisconsin, but after he graduated from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, he decided to stay in the Northeast. With the name Stickney paying homage to his ancestor Asa Stickney, who had been a Massachusetts private in the Continental Army, as well as a listing on the High Society Social Register, Peter wasn't lying when he said his family was old money. As was surely expected, Peter had done well as a banker and portfolio manager for various financial institutions, and had even become the president of the Philadelphia Securities Association. A member of the National Guard who served in Philadelphia's First City Troop, he was an active member of the community who regularly made appearances at balls and fundraisers.
But in recent years, Peter's silver spoon had lost some of its shine. After he quit his job as assistant vice president and portfolio manager of Mellon Bank's Center City Trust Group in 1988, he hadn't managed to find a different role. He went through another upheaval when he separated from his second wife, with whom, like his first wife, he had had one child in 1990 due to his sexual orientation. Although Peter remained involved in both of his children's lives and had his inheritance to thank for his one-bedroom luxury apartment at the Wanamaker House in Philadelphia, Peter's lack of a job was eating away at him. In the months leading up to his trip to New York, he had been drinking heavily and barely eating. When alcohol wasn't being served at lunch, he would sneak in a flask to pour into his tomato juice. He had drunk himself into unconsciousness at a Christmas party, and instead of getting him home, the other guests had pulled decorations from the tree to place on his still form. Wow, that's just hilarious.
It's something you'd expect dumb teenagers to do.
It is. Despite also passing out at the Blue Parrot, a gay bar in the Center City neighborhood of Philadelphia, Peter had no plans of slowing down. Having finished lunch at the Four Seasons with a business associate around 3 in the afternoon on May 3rd, 1991, Peter set off for New York City with his friend Tony Brooks, a former aide to a Philadelphia city councilman. Tony was the Republican candidate for a Philadelphia city council seat, and Peter was the chairman of his 91 committee. They were going to Manhattan for a political fundraiser held for Tony at his friend Robert Brown's apartment on Central Park West.
Tony and Peter, who was decked out in his signature bow tie, arrived at the New York real estate agent and gay rights activist apartment for the fundraiser around 5 p.m. Among the 35 guests in attendance was Tony Hoyt. When Tony Hoyt and Peter had first met in the mid 60s, neither had felt safe acting on their feelings. So they had both forced themselves to build the only kind of life they had been taught was worth living. But before Peter had met his wife, he and Tony Hoyt, then a married father, had reconnected years later and had an affair. The refuge they found with each other was temporary, though. Even though they had gathered the courage to express themselves in private, they knew they could never take their relationship public. The night they made their way back to each other in the spring of 1991 would also be the last of Peter's life. Having told Tony Brooks that he would be spending the night in New York, Peter left the fundraiser a few hours later with Tony Hoyt. The two former lovers headed to the townhouse bar, and several drinks, and around an hour and a half later, Tony sent Peter off in a cab destined for the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Peter stumbled into the hotel around 10:45 p.m., but abandoned his attempt to book a room in favor of heading to Penn Station. Unaware that Peter was last seen waiting for a taxi on Lexington Avenue near the Waldorf Astoria, his friends became concerned when he hadn't made an appearance at either the Blue Parrot or Raffles, the two Philadelphia piano bars he sought out for the renditions of Cole Porter and George Gershwin the following night.
Around 2:50 in the afternoon of the next day, May 5th, Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission maintenance worker John Siriania was emptying the trash barrels at a rest stop in Lancaster County on the westbound side of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Curious why some of the green plastic garbage bags in one of the containers were heavier than normal, he opened them up only to lay eyes upon the naked body of a dead man. Horrified, John used his radio to contact his supervisors, and they called the Pennsylvania State Police. As a truck driver whose delivery route went through eastern Pennsylvania and western New Jersey, Ronald Horner had heard all about John Siriania's dreadful discovery on his CB radio. 5 days after John had examined the trash contents at the Lancaster County rest area, Ronald made a pit stop on his way home at another rest area on the Pennsylvania Turnpike in Chester County around 8:15 a.m. About to throw away the trash that had accumulated in his truck, Ronald noticed some men's clothing in one of the trash barrels. Wondering if it could be connected to the body that had just been found, he reached out to a turnpike toll collector who informed the Pennsylvania State Police.
As would be the case with each of the murders, the related belongings paved the way for authorities to identify the body. National Guard dental records confirmed that the man who had been wrapped inside 8 layers of brown trash bags and thrown into a public garbage container was Staff Sergeant Peter Stickney Anderson. The killer's utter contempt for his victim couldn't have been more obvious. But although there were 3 palm prints and 28 fingerprints in total on these bags, none of them led to an identification. Even though the autopsy conducted the day after Peter's body was recovered offered investigators more information, it still didn't lead to his murderer. Dr. Isidore Michalakis noted the scrape on Peter's nose, the scratches on the right side of his neck, and the bruises on both of his forearms and his right shin. While Peter had sustained blunt force trauma to the head, as suggested by the bruising to his scalp, Dr. Michalakis determined that he had ultimately died from multiple stab wounds to the abdomen. Toxicology results showed that Peter had been intoxicated at the time of his murder, and there was evidence that he'd engaged in anal intercourse before his death. But it was only after his heart had stopped beating sometime between May 3rd and May 4th that his penis had been cut off and shoved into his throat as a final act of brutality.
My God.
I know. Despite the $1,000 reward offered by the Gay and Lesbian Community Center, Peter's family was left to bury him in Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts without any answers to provide them with even a modicum of closure. Sadly, the grief and uncertainty that would plague Peter's loved ones for years after his murder was about to come to haunt another family.
Thomas Mulcahy was born on July 24th, 1934. Like many Irish Catholic immigrants at the time, his mother Mary had immigrated to Boston, Massachusetts in search of a better life. Heeding his mother's words about the doors opened by education, Thomas dutifully left Boston College High School to earn his bachelor's degree in psychology from Boston College, then his graduate degree from New York City's Fordham University. It was while he was studying at Boston College that Thomas started dating Margaret Mary Casey, and the couple got married in 1958. Over 30 years later, they had raised 4 children together and were living in Sudbury, Massachusetts. Like with any marriage, though, the couple had their struggles. As the director of international account sales for the computer company Bull HN Information Systems, Inc., Thomas traveled often. In addition to the business he conducted on these trips, Thomas would drink and hook up with men he met in gay bars. After Margaret learned about his affairs in the early 90s, they began couples counseling to work through it. Margaret may have been concerned about her husband's extracurricular activities while he was away, but traveling was an undeniable part of 57-year-old Thomas's job. So, uneasy as his wife might have been, on July 7th, 1992, he left Massachusetts for Manhattan, checked into his room at the Barbizon Hotel, then went for dinner at the Townhouse restaurant.
The next morning, Thomas and his associate, William O'Brien, went to the World Trade Center to give a presentation. The pair then went to Moran's for a celebratory lunch. During the 3-hour meal, both Thomas and William had several drinks before they went their separate ways around 3 that afternoon. As William started the journey back to New Jersey, Thomas stuck to his plan of staying for another night to take advantage of the city's gay bars. Getting his evening off to the right start, around 4:15, Thomas had another 2 beers at the Marketplace Bar, then went to the Townhouse Bar, which was only 2 doors down from the Townhouse restaurant he had eaten in the night before. Around 10:30, Thomas was introduced to a man named Douglas Gibson. But although Douglas and Thomas got to talking, Thomas kept checking out the man beside the bar's piano. Douglas took the hint and left Thomas to it. The next thing Douglas knew, Thomas and the man he had been eyeing had left the townhouse. Thomas was supposed to be home in time for dinner the following evening. When that time came and went, Margaret decided she would call the Barbizon Hotel to get more information. After she reached out to hotel staff around 11 p.m., they followed up by going into Thomas's room. Inside, they saw that even though the man himself was missing, all of his clothes had been left behind.
2 days after Thomas disappeared on July 10th, 2 employees for the New Jersey Department of Transportation, named Theodore Doyle and Wayne Luker, were cleaning up the rest areas along Route 70 and 72. When they made it to the Butler Place rest area on Route 72, Wayne spotted some odd trash bags sitting around some of the trash cans. He quickly noticed that they weren't the ones used by the Department of Transportation, and upon closer inspection, discovered that one of the garbage bags seemed to have something shaped like a pumpkin inside. Just like it's never a mannequin, it's not going to be a pumpkin either.
Unfortunately not.
Surprisingly less suspicious was the fact that blood was seeping out of several of the bags, since homebound fishermen regularly threw fish parts into the garbage cans. Theodore and Wayne put these bags with the rest in the back of the dump truck. But once they were throwing them into the dumpster at the Red Line Maintenance Yard in Burlington County, Wayne's curiosity won out and he opened the bag that he had guessed contained a pumpkin. Instead of finding the seasonal favorite, Wayne found himself looking down at a severed head. Poor Wayne.
I think that pretty much sums it up. Around the same time that Wayne was alerting the New Jersey State Police to the presence of human remains, Anthony Bagarowski and Leon Valentino were doing one of their duties as Garden State Parkway employees by emptying the trash cans at the Stafford Forge rest area. When Leon couldn't get the liner bag out of one of the 55-gallon trash cans, he troubleshooted by removing the black garbage bags one at a time. This tedious task turned terrifying when one of the garbage bags split open and revealed a human leg. Like Wayne, Anthony wasted no time in calling the New Jersey State Police. Her worry growing as each hour ticked by, Margaret went to file a missing person report at the local police station. But minutes before she told the officers about Thomas, the New Jersey State Police called the station about the recent discovery of a dismembered body. And Margaret soon received the worst possible answer as to why her husband hadn't come home. In charge of cataloging everything that had been recovered, Sergeant John Halliday at the New Jersey State Police collected several plastic bags from the Stafford Forge rest area. Two of them were double bagged and double knotted, and each contained a human leg. At the Red Lion maintenance yard, a human head had been hidden in triple bagged white plastic trash bags, and the arms and upper and lower torso had been stored in double bagged trash bags.
Beyond the body parts, which also included intestines and stomach contents in another white bag, some of the many items Sergeant Halliday inventoried seemed to belong to a dismemberment kit used by a killer who had made little effort to cover his trail. There was a shower curtain, latex gloves, size 7 surgical gloves, a king size Liz Claiborne fitted sheet, an empty CVS latex glove box with its price sticker still attached, a master compass saw and blade, a master compass saw package that had a spare blade, and a price sticker for the home improvement store Pergament, and a plastic thank you for shopping here bag. Belongings pointing to the victim's identity were also recovered, such as a leather briefcase. The wallet, credit cards, and ID inside gave the police a pretty good idea of who their victim might have been, and they were left in no doubt once dental records confirmed Thomas Mulcahy's identity. Investigators immediately went to work finding out where these items had come from. Although objects like the shower curtain and Liz Claiborne fitted sheet could be purchased at most retail stores, the price sticker on the empty CVS latex glove box from the Red Lion maintenance yard was followed back to the only CVS pharmacy on Staten Island, where the staff attested to the fact that they had stocked these same gloves from April to early July of that year. In the same aisle as the latex gloves were the hefty garbage bags into which Thomas's dismembered body had been stuffed, and a Pergament store was only a short distance from that drugstore. While no fingerprints could be identified at the time, that wouldn't be the case forever.
But until that happy day arrived, authorities turned to the remains in the hope that they would provide more clues. On July 11th, 1992, Dr. Lila Perez concluded that Thomas's head had been severed from front to back at the fourth cervical vertebra. His torso had been split right above the belly button, and his arms had been disarticulated or separated at the joints, which left the bones intact. Fortunately, Thomas's dismemberment had taken place after he was already dead.
I mean, small mercies, what a monster.
A monster with medical knowledge, or at least an understanding of the human body. As for what had caused Thomas's death, Dr. Perez believed that the stab wounds to his chest and abdomen had penetrated the stomach, mesentery, which is a fold of membrane that connects the intestine to the wall surrounding the stomach area, lung, and heart, causing internal hemorrhage. Unsurprisingly, she ruled Thomas's death as a homicide. She believed that he had died sometime on July 9th while intoxicated. Even though ligature marks on his wrists indicated that he had been tied up before his murder, there was no evidence that he had been sexually assaulted. Thomas was laid to rest a week after his remains were recovered at Our Lady of Fatima Church in Sudbury, Massachusetts. Thomas and Peter had both been family men in their 50s. Both were known to visit gay bars, both had visited the townhouse bars shortly before their deaths, and both were found in trash bags at rest areas. But without a suspect or even a clear motive, the Pennsylvania and New Jersey police forces had little to work with. For now, their killer was still in the clear.
Although Puerto Rican born Anthony Marrero kept both his sexuality and his life as a sex worker a secret from his family ever since he had moved from the Philadelphia area and given up on a series of menial jobs, the 44-year-old could regularly be seen meeting Johns around Manhattan's Port Authority bus terminal, which had long been a popular spot for queer sex workers. While he could often be spotted around the Port Authority, Anthony didn't exclusively work from there, and on May 5th, 1993, he headed to Greenwich Village at noon to meet an unknown client. The meeting seems to have been uneventful enough because Anthony returned to the area around the Port Authority the next day, unaware that it would be for the last time. 4 days later, at 7:30 in the morning of May 10th, Donald Gibberson was driving down Crow Hill Road in Manchester Township, Ocean County, New Jersey, when he noticed something in the roadway. Donald hadn't run across a random piece of litter. He had stumbled upon a human arm with a section of clothesline trailing from it. He contacted the Manchester police, and authorities arrived to find multiple garbage bags containing the dismembered remains of Anthony Marrero.
The killer might not have chosen another well traveled rest stop as his dump site, but Donald had nonetheless spotted the arm because one of the trash bags had been opened by animals. In addition to the two white trash bags that had each contained one of Anthony's arms, several other bags were wrapped around a small plastic shopping bag stamped with the words, "Thank you," into which a severed head had been stuffed. Mirroring the disposal of Thomas Mulcahy's remains, Anthony's left and right legs and upper and lower torso had been shoved separately into various double and triple bagged garbage bags. Authorities also collected some unused plastic bags, including one that said, "We just can't say enough." Investigators soon figured out that the bag that had contained Anthony's head could have come from 11 different Acme stores, one of which was located on Staten Island. Beyond the thank you message, this limited edition bag proclaimed, "Made with pride by Bob H. and Jerry H. and President's Choice." The Acme on Staten Island just so happened to have started stocking them days before one was used for a decidedly less innocuous purpose than had been intended. Pinpointing a location didn't equate to definitively identifying a suspect, though, and authorities tried to trace the palm print from one plastic bag and the two fingerprints from the "We Just Can't Say Enough" bag by putting them into the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or AFIS, but they didn't get any hits.
Turning to what the bags had been hiding in the search for more information, Dr. Geeta Natarajan conducted Anthony's autopsy on May 12, 1993, 2 days after Donald had come across him. During his postmortem dismemberment, Anthony's murderer had cut through his bones to remove his limbs instead of separating them at the joints. More differences between Thomas's and Anthony's dismemberments included that the cut made to sever Anthony's head from his body was located between the third and fourth cervical vertebrae. And while his torso had been split 5 inches above his belly button, all his organs had been left inside. The ligature marks on Anthony's ankles appear to have been made post-mortem, and his toxicology screen only showed traces of marijuana. There was no indication that he had been sexually assaulted. Ultimately, Dr. Natarajan ruled that Anthony had died between May 5th and May 7th from multiple stab wounds to the back, as well as at least one to the front of his torso.
Now that Richard had gone to the trouble of figuring out the best way to dismember and dispose of the men he murdered, he had no plans on stopping. A discharged service member turned typesetter for the New York Law Journal, 56-year-old Michael Sakara was an openly gay man whose last long-term relationship had ended a few months earlier. Following a move from Philadelphia, Michael had found his place in Greenwich Village's Five Oaks Piano Bar, where he could often be heard singing the cabaret classic I'll Be Seeing You Before Last Call. On July 29th, 1993, Michael stuck to his routine and walked into the bar around 9:30 that evening. Almost 6 hours later, at around 3:30 in the morning, Richard sat on the bar stool beside Michael and asked for a scotch and water. Since he was a regular who was familiar with the staff, Michael introduced Richard, who said he worked as a nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital, to bartender Lisa Hall. After around an hour of chatting and drinking, Michael, who was 12 scotches deep by now, left the Five Oaks with Richard while the manager closed up for the night.
He was able to walk?
As we'll go on to see, Michael wasn't a lightweight, but still, I imagine he was feeling the effects, and it might have been more of a stumble than a walk. Michael talked with two acquaintances who were experiencing homelessness and mentioned his plans to go upstate. He said his goodbyes, and the pair watched him climb into the passenger seat of the car Richard was driving.
Around 10:30 the next morning, Ronald Colandria went to the Hudson River Overlook in Haverstraw, New York, where he operated his hot dog truck. Having set up shop there the previous day, Ronald saw that the 55-gallon trash barrel closest to his truck was almost half full. It had only been one-third full when he left the previous afternoon, and he was curious to see what had been thrown inside. Okay, I can safely say I would never be curious why the public trash barrel was full or what was inside.
I thought the exact same thing, but maybe it was just a really slow morning.
So he leaned in to get a closer look. On the top was a green plastic trash bag. Upon untying the knot, Ronald glimpsed what was obviously a human body part within a white plastic bag. Too overwhelmed to keep this information to himself, he told a customer what he had seen, and they agreed to go to the Haverstraw, New York Police Department, where they reported the discovery around 11:15. And no shade to Ronald, but shouldn't he have called the police without any suggestions from someone else? And is that the kind of thing discussed over a hot dog?
It's really not, but to be fair, I can see a world where I'd be so taken aback at finding a body part that I blurted out to the first person I saw and need to be reminded that the police have to be informed.
Maybe so. And I notice it's always the men that want to open up the sacks. Just saying.
It's true.
As a volunteer fireman with the Stony Point Department, James Benison already knew that a human head and arms had been collected from the Hudson River Overlook in Haverstraw 9 days earlier when he drove his motorcycle into a pull off area around 10 miles away on Route 9W in Stony Point, New York. Having spotted four green plastic garbage bags beyond the cable guardrail, James lifted one of them. The source of the stench emanating from the bag on that summer evening became apparent when James noticed the outline of a human leg. There was no need for further investigation on his part, and James contacted the police around 8 that night.
As had been the case with Thomas Mulcahy and Anthony Marrero, Michael Sequeira's body had been dismembered into 7 pieces and discarded in separate trash bags. Once his head and arms were collected from Haverstraw and his legs and upper and lower torso were recovered from the bags from Stony Point, Dr. Frederick T. Zugaby got to work examining them. He noted that the multiple fractures to the skull were comminuted, or broken in a minimum of 2 places. Add on the blunt force lacerations to both Michael's forehead and the back of his head, and it wasn't shocking that his brain was bruised and swollen. While the severe head injuries had killed him, Michael's upper torso also showed 2 stab wounds and his lower torso displayed 3 puncture marks. Although some kind of knife had definitely been used on Michael, his bones had been cut with a fine-tooth saw, because, like Anthony, Michael hadn't been disarticulated. His head had been cut off at the third cervical vertebra, his arms had been detached right below the shoulder joint, and the severed ends of his legs had been covered with an addition at the New York Times. Unlike Thomas and Anthony, the lack of ligature marks on the body indicated that Michael hadn't been tied up either before or after his death between July 30th and July 31st. Like with the other 3 men, the murderers seemed to have used Michael's altered state of consciousness against him. Just as the marijuana in Anthony's system had likely made him more vulnerable, The alcohol in Peter's, Thomas's, and Michael's bloodstreams had been weaponized against them by their killer.
It was clear to authorities that Peter Anderson, Thomas Mulcahy, Anthony Marrero, and Michael Sequeira had been murdered and disposed of in an unmistakably similar manner, and many of the investigators were more than willing to work together to catch the perpetrator. That didn't hold true for all of them, though. The New York City police delayed getting involved with the Joint Task Force by referencing jurisdictional issues, but they eventually teamed up with the Pennsylvania State Police, Ocean County Prosecutor's Office, the New Jersey State Police, and the Rockland County District Attorney's Office. Achieving interagency collaboration was one thing, but it wasn't the only obstacle in this uphill battle. Blatant homophobia didn't just exist in the NYPD, and witnesses didn't want their names connected to the gay bars 3 of the victims had been seen leaving. Just like when authorities had run into a brick wall after putting the fingerprints found with Anthony's body into APIS, none of the various fingerprints from any of the 4 crime scenes could be identified. And even after asking the FBI to step in, the investigation stalled by the end of 1993. The case may have been on the back burner for some, but for the victims' loved ones, the lack of answers only compounded their loss. In 1999, Thomas's wife Margaret reached out to Matthew Kuhn, a member of the New Jersey State Police who had been the head of the task force, to ask if they had made any headway in the investigation. In her relentless pursuit of justice, she had hired a private investigator, but she also requested a meeting with Matthew. Go, Margaret.
For real, good on her. In the nearly 7 years that had gone by, technology had advanced leaps and bounds. In particular, fingerprinting technology could now help identify previously unidentifiable prints. So, after Margaret's push, the Joint Task Force dived back into the case in July 2000 by sending the evidence from Thomas's murder to the Toronto Police Service, where it could be re-fingerprinted with vacuum metal deposition, a technique that uses metals like gold and zinc to enhance fingerprints. The new technique paid off, and 17 fingerprints were recovered from the Thank You for Shopping Here bag and one of the white plastic bags. They were compared to those that had been preserved in Anthony's case, and 16 were found to belong to the same unidentified person. These prints were copied and distributed to crime labs in every state to be entered into their individual databases. As compared to the lack of hits in 1993, now that Maine had its automated fingerprint identification system online, on May 14th, 2001, fingerprint analyst Kim Stevens told the Rockland County District Attorney's Office that they had a match to a man who had been in the Penobscot County criminal record system since his arrest for the murder of Frederick Spencer in 1973, Richard Rogers.
All in all, Richard's prints were matched to 18 of the Anderson fingerprints and 1 of the palm prints, 16 of the Mulcahy fingerprints, and 2 of the Marrero fingerprints and the palm print. It seemed that Richard's last murder was also his cleanest because none of the Sequeira fingerprints could be identified as his. But as we know from the beginning of the episode, Richard admitted to knowing Michael from the Five Oaks piano bar, meaning investigators could connect him in some way or another to all 4 murders. No longer laboring under the delusion that he had been the victim of credit card fraud or that he had been brought into the police station as anything other than the prime suspect, on May 28, 2001, after nearly 8 years of believing he had gotten away with his crimes, Richard clammed up. Now that they had Richard on the back foot, Lieutenant Thomas Hayes from the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office and Detective David Dalrymple from the New Jersey State Police systematically laid out the evidence they had against him. When Lieutenant Hayes said that Richard's fingerprints were discovered at the Anderson crime scene, Richard started swallowing, nodding, and gulping air. The walls continued closing in on him as he was told that his fingerprints were retrieved from the Mulcahy and Marrero crime scenes, that some of the items collected were traced to his home base of Staten Island, and that Lisa Hall, the bartender at the Five Oaks, identified Richard as the man Michael left the bar with on the last night he was ever seen alive. After all the evidence was presented once more, Richard asked for an attorney.
But no lawyer could make the plethora of physical and circumstantial evidence against Richard disappear. He hadn't even bothered to get himself an alibi. To fit his serial killer career around his actual job at Mount Sinai Hospital, he would take on the late shifts every other day and save his paid time off to take a yearly trip. But travel wasn't the only activity Richard was interested in. For each window in which the four murders took place, Richard wasn't on his usual 8:30 p.m. to 8 a.m. nursing shift. He was busy gaining the trust of the men he targeted at gay bars, and it is possible that he even met Anthony in one too, because although Anthony usually worked around and was last seen near the Port Authority bus terminal, he would also sometimes pick up clients from Midtown Manhattan gay bars. To this end, Richard would occasionally admit that he was a nurse, but he would fudge the details to protect himself by saying that he worked at St. Vincent's Hospital instead of Mount Sinai, as he claimed to Michael and Lisa. After he killed Michael, Richard didn't return to these bars for years. When he felt it was safe to come back to his old haunts, he gave various excuses for his extended absence, such as that he had been living in Florida or that he had a new work schedule. But even though investigators knew the bars Richard had used as his hunting ground, the cleaned and dismembered remains of all four victims meant that they never figured out where the murders themselves took place.
Despite not knowing where the murders had been carried out, the police had more than enough to arrest Richard. While he was being held on a $1 million bail, authorities searched the Staten Island apartment Richard had been living in between 1985 and 2000, but they didn't find anything. But then they searched his current Staten Island condominium. Inside the Bridgecourt property, they found a treasure trove of evidence. They collected some familiar looking bags, such as a tan "Thank you for shopping here" bag, a New Jersey road map purchased at Pergament, the same store the master compass saw package had come from, photos of shirtless men with red wounds drawn on them, a date rape drug, and 8 videos. The videos that police collected from Richard's bedroom included the thriller Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, which showed graphic acts of decapitation and dismemberment, such as a hand being severed with a meat cleaver. Authorities also bagged a Bible with passages that depicted dismemberment bookmarked, such as the murder of Ishbosheth, who escaped with a nurse, only to end up with his decapitated head brought to King David, who in turn punished the murderers by chopping off their hands.
Even though authorities strongly believed that dismemberment obsessed Richard had murdered all four men, because forensic evidence only conclusively pinned him to two victims, he was only tried for the murders of Thomas Mulcahy and Anthony Marrero. Prosecutors had chosen to go for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty, so 55-year-old Richard Rogers took his chances and turned down the plea deal offered to him on October 26, 2005. And once he had been extradited to New Jersey, the state in which Thomas's and Anthony's remains had been discovered, his trial began days later. On November 10th, 2005, after 3 hours and 45 minutes of deliberation, the Ocean County jury convicted the man the press had luridly dubbed the last call killer of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of third-degree hindering apprehension for dismembering and dumping the bodies of his victims. In January 2006, court judge James Cheetah called Richard an evil human being and handed down the maximum penalties in giving him 2 life sentences for the murders plus 5 years for the hindering counts, all of which were to be served consecutively. Not eligible for parole until 2066, by which time he would have celebrated his 116th birthday, Richard remains behind bars at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton and continues to profess his innocence.
As usual, he appealed partly because the judge ruled during a pretrial hearing that the evidence relating to the murders of Peter Anderson and Michael Sequeira would be admissible for the prosecution to demonstrate identity, opportunity, intent, and plan. Because of this, the dissimilarities in Peter's and Michael's deaths and dismemberments had to be considered. For instance, Peter wasn't fully dismembered. only his penis was amputated. It was theorized that Richard hadn't felt the need because Peter had only been 5 feet 4 inches tall and 102 pounds and could fit into an 8 layered bag. Richard may have double and triple bagged the dismembered body parts, but likely due to the weight of Peter's entire body, he felt it was necessary to use 8 layers. Michael's size was also the reason his cause of death differed from the other three. Although he too had sustained stab wounds to the torso, they hadn't killed him. Unlike Peter, Thomas, and Anthony, Michael had died from blunt force trauma to the head. At around 6 feet 4 inches tall and 235 pounds, Michael was far larger than Richard, who was only 6 feet and 170 pounds. Richard might have decided to bash him over the head either to have a single, more obvious target or to subdue him faster. Even though there weren't any fingerprints linking Richard to Michael as with the other three, Michael's naked remains were also discovered in trash bags and, more tellingly, dismembered in almost the exact same way that Anthony had been, with a saw having been used to cut through his bones. Thankfully, the many connections between the four victims, murders, and disposals meant that Richard's conviction was upheld in 2008.
Out of the four men Richard murdered, only Michael Sakara felt able to live authentically. Peter Anderson, Thomas Mulcahy, and Anthony Marrero had all hidden their sexuality, and not without reason. Anthony was described in the New York Times as, and these are their words, not ours, a crack addict and prostitute who was defined by his unsuccessful marriage, substance use disorder, and gay sex work.
That sure sounds like victim blaming.
It sure does. And it took years for the dismissive and dehumanizing rhetoric surrounding sex work and sexuality to shift even slightly. While we may like to think that the deaths and disappearances of sex workers or members of the LGBTQ plus community wouldn't be apathetically viewed as an inevitability today, the shame surrounding both identities persists. Anthony's brother continues to deny that Anthony was gay, which prevented his grandson Antonio, who is bisexual and can speak to the family's longstanding homophobia, from finding out about his great uncle earlier,
Denial runs deep.
especially when that's the family line. It makes sense that for some of the victims' loved ones, their view of them has remained unchanged. Their relatives will always be frozen in time, living on only in their memories and thereby colored by their own perspectives. That's not the case for all of them, though. When their father's murderer was finally sentenced, Thomas Mulcahy's children were able to acknowledge that he was both a devoted father and a man who struggled with alcohol use disorder and his bisexuality. Thomas's daughter Susan said, "My father died senselessly at the hands of a monster, and I can only hope that it never happens to anyone else."
But as you would expect, Louise Spencer, Frederick's mother, said Richard's later arrest brought them little comfort. After all, if he had only stayed behind bars after killing her son, 4 other men would still be alive. So true.
Yeah, we can say it a couple more times.
Yeah. At least 4 other men, that is, because some speculate that there are more murders that the authorities are hesitant to connect to Richard without more evidence, such as those of Matthew, Piero, and Jack Andrews. The last time anyone saw Matthew Piero alive in 1982, he was walking out of a gay bar in Florida, an area Richard happened to be visiting at the time. Matthew's body was soon discovered not far from Interstate 4. He had been strangled and stabbed 6 times. Richard was also suspected of killing Jack Andrews in 1986 after his dismembered body was found in trash bags at a rest stop in Litchfield, Connecticut. Considering what Richard would later become known for, it's more than possible that he targeted Matthew at a gay bar and disposed of Jack's remains in trash bags at another northeastern rest area.
Due to Richard's continued claims of innocence, we can only guess as to what his motive might have been. Richard's decision to disgustingly discard the gay and bisexual men he killed in garbage bags certainly suggests a level of homophobia. But his preference for picking up his victims in gay bars also speaks to the fact that, as a gay man himself, he was able to prey on fellow members of the community in one of the few places they felt any sense of safety. And we're going to end with an announcement. Starting with our next episode, instead of doing themes, we'll be covering one off cases. We know that we've gotten tired of some of the themes, two parts on female killer nurses, even with a break, ended up being a bit much. And we definitely don't want any of you to feel that way. Because of that, we're rebranding and changing the podcast name to Culprit. We're excited about the shift, and we hope you'll all appreciate it too. That said, next time we'll be discussing the case of Walter Leroy Moody Jr.
All the sources we use for this episode are in the show notes below. We'll give you our updated email address and social media handles next time. But in the meantime, feel free to leave us a comment, rating, or review to let us know what you think. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you soon.